Did you know that the Bible never mentions how the Virgin Mary died? No one knows where she was buried. And yet, both Jerusalem and Ephesus claim to guard her tomb. The story of her death, or her disappearance, remains one of Christianity's oldest mysteries. After her son's crucifixion, Mary vanishes from Scripture. But early Christian writings from the 2nd century tried to fill that silence. The so-called apocryphal Gospels tell a forgotten episode, the Dormition of Mary, the moment when the Mother of God fell into a deep sleep before being taken to heaven. According to the ancient Transitus Mariae, the apostles were miraculously gathered in Jerusalem to bid her farewell. Peter anointed her with sacred oil, and Mary asked that no one weep. "My soul rejoices, for I will see my son again." Her body was placed in a tomb in the valley of Josaphat. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. Only a mysterious fragrance remained. By the 5th century, Byzantine fathers had embraced this tradition as doctrine. In 431, the Council of Ephesus proclaimed her Theotokos, Mother of God. From that moment, the Eastern Church spoke of her dormition, and the West of her Assumption. Archaeologists still debate whether Mary died in Jerusalem or Ephesus. Monks from the Mount of Olives say her tomb vanished after being sealed. Others claim she never died at all. She was taken up to heaven, body and soul. In 1950, Pope Pius XII declared it dogma. Mary was assumed into heaven, but he never said if she died first. The mystery endures. Perhaps her empty tomb is not a riddle to solve, but a symbol, a woman's triumph over death. The hope of all who believe in something beyond flesh and time. If this story moved you, subscribe, because some mysteries of the past still breathe today.